Okay, so I'm going to be analyzing 3 games today that were submitted via our Patreon. We have a special game analysis tier, and yeah, these are a couple games that were submitted. I think this is actually going to be finishing up, or almost finishing up November of last year because we're a little bit behind, but then I'll be getting to the December games. I think I'm actually just gonna start doing these streams on Fridays. Seems to be a good time for me. To just come on and show a couple of games that were submitted. These are all annotated games, and so the idea of this project is to kind of encourage our members to annotate and analyze their games, and to put their thoughts on paper, which I think is really helpful when it comes to kind of like retaining some of the lessons that you learned from each game. And so yeah, with the show we try to, or with the game analysis, we try to give feedback not just on the moves, but also on the annotations themselves. And maybe I can offer advice on how to extract more value out of the notes and the analysis. So the games that I'm going to be doing today, they were, I think, pretty nicely detailed. Okay, so I'll be starting with this game here, which was submitted by Waynebeam. And this was a Lichess classical game, 30 plus 30. So part of the Lone Wolf League. And okay, Wayne mentions he didn't use the engine to analyze this game, which is good to see. I think me and Jesse do appreciate that. At least when you submit your notes, we want to hear your thoughts, right? Because of course we can check with the engine ourselves, but we want to know what you were thinking during the game. And okay, the ratings here I have listed are I believe Lichess classical ratings of the 2 players. So we get Fianchetto King's Indian, and white goes b3. Wayne mentions he's following the keep it simple chessable repertoire, which I think has this. And it does make sense as a system. I would just say against the King's Indian because it's very simple. You already developed one bishop to g2. You put this bishop to b2. Knight comes out to d2, and then white tries to take over the center with e4 or c4, knight c3, and then e4, and so on. So definitely a good approach. So knight d7, bishop b2. Black played c5, and here white goes e3, which I think is maybe the first moment where Wayne could definitely improve their play here, because I think white doesn't fully understand what they're kind of fighting for in the position, and what that is space. So I believe the right move is probably c4, just taking space in the center of the board, preparing to bring the knight to c3, and eventually we might get a type of Marazzi structure. After takes, knight takes d4. White can then play for e4, and then we'll just get like a pure Marazzi. So Wayne mentioned he didn't want to allow exactly this. That's why white goes e3 in the game, so that on cd4 he can go e takes d4. But this isn't all that great for white. Of course, black doesn't have to take on d4 in the game. Black goes rook b8, which I think is a better move, actually, just more flexible. But the point here with c4 is that this position is not that fun for black. Like, the knight gets out to c5, but then white gets knight c3, and the real problem with black's position is the light square bishop just has a really hard time finding a good square. And this is the issue when you don't have a lot of space, is that your pieces don't have a lot of squares to choose from. Bishop g4 always gets kicked with h3, and so the bishop has to just play on d7, but this is just kind of passive. Black's pieces aren't actually doing anything, they're not really targeting much, and yeah, in general I would say this is kind of a passive position for black where things have gone wrong. So black probably, whoops, just to go back to the opening. So I'm not a huge fan of this knight d7 and c5, because the best that black can get here is just kind of some kind of Marazzi bind where it's not really such a great version. Black hasn't managed to exchange any pieces, and here white can play like h3 or e4 or rook c1, like lots of nice little improving moves. Eventually knight d5 can be played just to kind of take over the center, and yeah, white just has a very comfortable edge. So this is kind of what white is playing for with the let's say this like double fianchetto is just playing c4 and slowly taking over the center. Okay, but that's just kind of a point on the opening. The main thing that we'll probably talk about in this game was really just going to be the technique, because Waynebeam, I think, plays it pretty well. We get knight d2, b5, c4, and I would say better late than never. Although I should note, I think Black had a tactical idea here with takes, knight takes, and bishop a6, which seems like both players missed. Threatening to take here and win the bishop on b2, and also threatening d5 and just winning the exchange. And I think White might even have to just give up the exchange here. I didn't really see a way to defend against both threats. But okay, strategically the move I think is perfectly sound. It's just this kind of tactical idea to point out. Now Black starts with bishop a6, queen c2, queen a5, a4, and now Black probably makes maybe the biggest strategic mistake of the game, b takes a4. Because after taking on a4, rook takes a4, we get this structure with the pawns on b3 and c4, and the bishop on a6 just becomes a really bad piece. Here it was putting pressure, and of course Black should take on c4 here, or even play b4 before taking on a4 and giving White the open a file. But definitely b takes c4 was the right move. And then actually it's very much a fighting game. Like White doesn't have an obvious structural advantage here. I think Black's pieces are placed pretty well. But after takes, now things start to look extremely good for White. Just simple open a file, and already White is winning a pawn. And yeah, total disaster for Black. And Wayne doesn't even take it. He goes bishop c3, which I think totally justified. I mean, White could have taken the pawn, and Wayne writes he just didn't want to trade off all the rooks like this. And okay, it's a clean pawn up, but I can kind of understand, like, doesn't seem like the easiest position to convert. So instead there's bishop c3, just inserting some pressure onto Black's queen side with bishop a5. And yeah, so I think White just continues really well. Queen c6. It was knight h4 here. Okay, this one maybe not necessary, probably d5 right away. And White just has overwhelming space advantage here and is just doing, yeah, extremely well. Bishop on b7, I should note, is just horribly misplaced, because now it's more or less like a King's Indian type of position. And this bishop on b7 is just super, super restricted. And White is, of course, just going to moments away from breaking on the queen side and just blowing open the game. Knight e1, knight d3 is a typical plan, and so on. And rook on a1 is defended, so Black doesn't have any tactics on the diagonals, any kind of knight e4s or anything, because rook is protected. And I mentioned this because I think Wayne kind of miscalculated something in their notes, because they said they were looking at this one, and then bishop takes a1 here, and queen takes on e7, but actually White can just take back, and it's two pieces for the rook, and so this whole tactic is just not working for Black. So yeah, that was already possible. Instead we get knight h4, and now d5. And okay, a little bit of a waste, because the knight is just going to have to come back, but not a big deal. Black goes e5, which, okay, gives us a very close position, and now White is, again, just long-term much better. Bishop h3. White can also play e4 here and just take that space advantage, make it a little bit harder for Black to play f5. I think e4 definitely was worth it, but in the game it actually turns out very nicely, because bishop h3, Black goes knight h5, and then White gets knight e4. So White can actually use this square, and all of a sudden Black can't defend d6 pawn. So just terrible for Black. And now White has snagged the pawn and goes knight takes b7. Now Wayne actually criticizes this move a little bit in his notes, because he doesn't think he should trade off this bad bishop, but the alternative was probably something like knight e4. This allows Black to expand f5 and then e4. Black kind of builds up with tempo and, okay, gets a couple of moves and can definitely still make this a very, very complicated fight, because Black has made some nice progress on the king side. So I kind of like knight takes b7 for a couple of reasons. number one, we're keeping the tempo because we're making a forcing move. Black has to take back, and now white can play something on the next move, like e4, for example, to prevent black from playing f5 comfortably, or moving the bishop to go after the a-pawn, and so on. So I like that instead of going back and giving the opponent time, we're actually just being forcing. And also this bishop on b7, although it's a very passive piece, is still a very important bishop in the position. So it's still, I think, a good trade for white to take this one off. It's holding the queen side together with this a6 pawn, and of course now white's light square bishop becomes really, really strong. So takes, bishop c3. Like I mentioned, I definitely would have considered e4 here, just to make it very difficult for black to play f5. And maybe this move really should have been played, just to kind of limit the counterplay. Though, but white does in the game is also completely winning, so I can't really, I don't really want to don't feel like it deserves much criticism. So f5, rook takes a6, white is breaking through on the queen side, f4, and now rook e6, queen f7, and rook takes e5. I mean, it looks to me very, very straightforward. And again, Wayne is a little bit critical of this play, but I think it's a good call because white is winning the queen with bishop e6. Now there are other things white could do here as well, like rook a7 feels very natural, just going after the 7th rank. Because black's counterplay, it's coming, but it's quite slow, and white has a number of pieces on the king side. And that's kind of the nice thing about these fianchetto positions, is that the king on g1 generally feels pretty safe. The bishop does a nice job defending it. And without a light squared bishop, it's going to be very hard for black to pose any kind of serious problems here. So yeah, white has time for like rook a7, but I mean, winning the queen is winning the queen. So I think white played this one very well. But as we see, Wayne gets into serious difficulties. Okay, so f takes g3 played. And now white takes on f7. And this one gets a question mark from Wayne, which I think is valid. Because, yeah, there was no reason to take right away. In fact, it would probably just be more practical to recapture on g3 and force black to take on e6 and get some extra time. Also, if queen takes e6, d takes e6, you know, we're not bringing black's rook to f7, where it clearly looks active. So we kind of get the exchange on better terms, even though at this point, white is now winning a queen. It's going to have, black will have a rook and a minor piece in return, but white has like more pawns. So white is just completely winning. But Wayne ends up losing this one, and it's quite tragic, but definitely a very instructive game to learn from. So let's see what happens. So takes, h takes g3. And already here, actually, and I really like Wayne's notes because it really helped me understand what happened. Here, Wayne mentions that he spent 6 minutes on this move. And remember, this was a G30 game, so it's not the longest game. G30 is, you know, basically almost rapid. And so at this point, we're down to, I think it looks like under about 3.5 minutes. So going all the way from like 8 or 9 minutes to 3.5 minutes on this one recapture. And that seems like a big mistake, because like intuitively, it might feel like, okay, maybe there's a difference between the two captures. Maybe one of them is objectively better. But this is something that should really be kind of evaluated, I think, much faster when we're down to like 8 or 9 minutes. This has to be like, I think, maximum like a 30-second to 1 minute decision. Given that there's not really a lot to calculate here, it's more just about trying to figure out whether it's better to play FG or HG. And I guess there are reasons to play FG. I think objectively they're both still totally winning for white. The reason to go FG is maybe if you would want to like use the open F file or something. Here that doesn't really seem to be possible, right? Since after FG we're not playing rook F1 anytime soon. So to my eyes, I probably play HG very quickly in this position because I don't want to weaken the E3 pawn, and this structure it just feels a lot safer for the king than this one. So unless we have like a specific reason, like we really want to go FG, I think it would be kind of inaccurate to play FG here, but definitely a mistake to spend over, you know, half your time in a position like 8 or 9 minutes left spend over half your time on this move, because we're not leaving ourselves with a lot of time for the. And clearly, it's still going to be a complicated game, right? Like black has a ton of pieces. It's very easy to blunder the queen back to some trick, especially in time trouble. So I think the clock usage here is definitely important. And Wei notes that they were feeling so nervous that they couldn't think straight. And if that's true, that's definitely something to reflect on, because if you get into this like mindset where you're like panicking, your heart's racing, your palms are starting to get sweaty, and I think everyone knows this feeling, like when you're in time trouble. Of course, everyone plays worse when they're in that zone. So I would really encourage folks to like either try to avoid time pressure altogether if you feel like it always makes you panic, or try to come up with some strategies for dealing with it, because like you are going to get into time trouble in your games, and if you're just going to collapse every time that happens, like that's definitely not a good recipe for success. It's also just not very enjoyable to just be like super stressed out because you have like a couple minutes left, and like you can't calculate anymore, and you've been playing a great game up until this point, playing really well, but all of a sudden it's like the pressure is kind of getting to you, and you can no longer think clearly or think objectively. So something that's worked for me in OTB chess and a little bit online is just trying to breathe like very consistently and like rhythmically, even just to kind of like take slow, deep, patient breaths, especially once I kind of start feeling internally like, uh-oh, I'm getting a little panicky. I just try to breathe, and that helps me kind of calm down and start seeing the position clearly again. I'm sure there's probably other ways to kind of control your nerves and emotions during the game, but definitely I'm not an expert on this topic. That's just something that's kind of worked for me. So, but the main thing I want to stress is that like this is a really big deal, because like you will be playing in time trouble, all the time. Lots of games come down to it. Even if you have a completely winning position, you still might have to make one or two decisions when you're, down to 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 3 minutes, and you still have to be able to kind of at least calculate a little bit. So definitely something to at least think about and reflect on, because it's of course going to be affecting your results if every time we get in time pressure, we end up collapsing and start blundering. So yeah, as much as we can, we want to try to stay calm and just continue just analyzing the position, as rationally and objectively as we can, looking for the opponent's threats, looking for what we can do, what our plan might be, and so on. So anyway, after HG, the game actually ends very, very quickly here. Knight G4 is played. And it looks scary, black is attacking f2, but even once black takes on f2, it's not exactly clear how white's king is getting mated. This line on h4 does a great job of covering the g2 square for any kind of future, like rook takes f2, knight takes e3. It's very hard to see how black actually mates white's king. So there's not a ton of reason for white to panic here. White ends up playing rook f1, looks like a nice move, defends f2 pawn, but actually ends up blundering into knight takes g3. And now things are very, very tricky for whites, and the game ends up ending after takes, check, king h6, white goes f4, and misses knight e2 check. Very unfortunate, but it happens. And at this point, white is now down to like 15 seconds, so it's not really a surprise that we ended up blundering the queen with like, again, 15 seconds on the clock. So it's the real mistakes I think were made leading up to this moment, where we're spending too much time and also kind of panicking, and we kind of lost all sorts of objectivity about the complications, like what might happen. So yeah, at this point, I think there's different ways for white to play. It definitely makes sense to trade off the bishops, and if black plays, I don't know, something like rook takes f2. Actually, Wayne mentions in his notes that this one is totally feasible, just taking on f8, and bishop takes c5. And white simplifies a little bit, but has a million pawns on the queen side, and this position does look pretty straightforward. Sure, black can take here, but again, actually, it's not clear how white's king is getting mated. It looks very potentially scary, and there are checkmates like knight e5, knight f3 would be a mate if not for the knight on h4. But yeah, seems like white actually has quite enough here to cover the king. And in the meantime, white's just playing d6, bishop d4, rook a8 check, just getting their own counterplay, of course. So that would be a pretty straightforward approach. White can also just play queen e4. And again, black doesn't actually have any real threats. It just looks a little scary around the king, but white's queen is very, very strong here. And so this is just, yeah, pretty straightforward for white. So it was winning. I think Wayne would have won the game if not for this kind of like panicking, which is very, very common in chess. And that's why I'm kind of discussing it, because I feel like lots of good games are ended up blown in this kind of time trouble phase. And I would imagine that the players that are kind of better at controlling their nerves, generally they get away with more stuff in these time scrambles, because they can kind of handle the tactics a little bit better. And yeah, that ends up deciding a lot of stuff. So yeah, unfortunate game, but I really appreciate the submission, because I think this is a game that we've all played at some point, where we're just totally winning. We win the opponent's queen, like, okay, just game over. But they still have pieces. They get a little bit of counterplay, time trouble. We know we're winning, but we don't know how to defend, and then it ends up lost. No, white had a 30-second increment in the game, but even then, like 30 seconds it's some time, of course, but it's not a lot of time when, the difference between like playing blitz and playing classical that devolves down into a time scramble is that when you start off the classical game, you're taking your time and you're thinking through your moves. Then you have to adjust to this kind of new format where you don't have a lot of time. Whereas when you play blitz, of course, you're just keeping the pace the whole time and you're playing quickly. So it's not as hard to adjust, obviously, when you're running low on time, because you've already just been playing fast. So in blitz, of course, 30 seconds seems like a lot, especially like a 30-second increment. It seems like an eternity. But when you were playing the whole game at a slower pace and now you're down, then that starts to get really, really stressful. And you got like 30 seconds left, 45 seconds left. You feel like it's going to run out immediately. Just somehow something weird with how our brains perceive time. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks, Wayne, again for the submission, and hopefully that was instructive for you. Next game here submitted was from Spence. And I'm pretty sure I got their ratings wrong, because actually Spence was the lower rated player in this encounter at 1704. And his opponent was 1930. And I believe Spence mentioned that these are OTB ratings. And I think it's ECF, so the English Chess Federation. But I know they have a different system, so this might be like a conversion from that or something. But let's just 1700, 1900 OTB ratings, I think, is the best estimate here. Okay, so this was actually a very interesting game. A couple of instructive moments in this one. We have a Rosalimo. Oh, ECF switched to FIDE-like ratings here. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's good, because no one knew how to convert it. At least I never knew. I would always have to ask someone like how to convert the ECF ratings. Okay, so we get Rosalimo with e6. This is a pretty typical way for black to play this one. G6 is also really, really common these days. And white goes c3, knight f6, and queen e2 here. And this was a little bit of a strange setup. In his notes, Spence mentions that next time he's probably going to go for castles in this position, so not committing to c3. And then on knight e7, which is the main move, rook e1. And I think this is a good switch, because I checked the database and it seems like the top guys are pretty much playing this one exclusively. Like the people that play bishop b5, if their opponent is playing e6, almost everyone is castling in this position, so not playing like c3 or d3. And then on knight e7, which again is the main move, playing rook to e1, so that the bishop has a square on f1. And in case of a6, white does go ahead and play bishop f1, and there is some, of course, quite a bit of theory here. Black plays d5, white takes this one, knight takes d4, and game continues. Anyway, it's a pretty straightforward position for white. We're just kind of developing, playing in the center, and so on. In case black plays knight f6, though, I just want to point this out, because in the game, black actually doesn't go knight e7. On c3, black plays knight f6, which makes a little bit more sense now that white committed this one here. But just in case we get this one, if black plays knight f6 without white having committed to c3 and with white just castling instead, then I would go ahead and just play e5, knight d5. In his notes, Spence gives knight c3, but I would probably just take this one and suggest playing this structure. Black has to take back, but either way, the problem for black is long-term. These pawns are super, super weak. You can't play d6 without completely isolating the c-pawns, and white is just playing like d3 here, c4, knight d2, bringing the knight to e4, and black has pretty much like the worst two bishops in all of chess, like these structures, especially the light square bishop is really really a very, very difficult piece for black in this kind of position. So I would imagine some opponents might just be kind of casually developing the knight to f6, not realizing, of course, that knight e7 is very important so that black can take back with the knights. But yeah, just something to keep in mind, that this is definitely a structure that I think white should be aiming for. If we're going to play bishop b5 in the Rossolimo. Anyway, so c3, and I think Spence actually blunders in this opening with castles, not realizing that knight takes e4 actually wins a pawn, somewhat surprisingly. But bishop on b5 is hanging, and if bishop takes c6, then queen takes c6, covers the knights. But both players missed this one. Black goes bishop e7, and white plays bishop a4. And okay, it's kind of a logical setup, like white wants to put the bishop on c2 and then maybe prepare like d4 and get almost kind of like a Ruy Lopez type of setup. But it is a little bit slow, and so black ends up being pretty much fine here. But all right, we already talked about the opening, and that this maybe isn't the most ambitious setup for white. So castles, white goes for e5 now. And Spence mentioned that he would have liked to play rook d1, but didn't like black playing e5 in return. And I think actually, I'm not sure this would be the worst thing in the world, because with e5, okay, black gets some space, but also gives up the light squares, and now white maybe can use this diagonal in the future, or like d3, knight d2, knight c4. I'm not sure if this is really the worst thing for white. So maybe this was playable, or even just the immediate d3, and then bringing the bishop back and eventually pushing for d4. The problem with e5 is that this pawn is extended, and after knight d5, bishop c2 is played. Black plays a pretty good idea f5 here. Actually, maybe it was even better to go f6 with kind of the same plan, but f6 might be a little bit more accurate because it encourages white to take on f6, which is what black wants, for white to kind of surrender the center. On f5, probably white shouldn't have taken en passant, but white does, and Spence writes fear of missing out, which is very funny, and not the first time I've taken en passant in a dubious situation. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's of course, it feels like, yeah, you kind of want to take because this is your only chance, but you really have to judge it position by position. So I would try to avoid any kind of rules like always take en passant or never take en passant. Like it really just depends. You want to open the position or not. And here taking on f6 I think ends up being a mistake because black ends up getting a very nice pawn center. And but it's kind of instructive how black gets an advantage in this one. So yeah, probably better was to go d3 here, or try to again go like rook d1 and play for d4. Then things are not so bad. Like d3, knight can come to d2 and c4, and white can really support this kind of stronghold on e5. So this was definitely still the way to go. And it's a very complicated structure. Like black has their advantages, knight on d5, they got some space on the king side, but bishop is still on c8, and black has to spend some time probably solving this problem with queen c7 and b6 and so on. In the meantime, white will play knight d2, knight c4, and have this nice control over e5. So what happens in the game is takes, queen e4, black goes g6, knight a3, and now very strong move, knight d7. I think really instructive move. Because it looks like a strange backwards move, but black prepares to just play d5, e5, and completely take over the center. And now white's just not really in time to develop. So very nicely played. Knight c4, queen c7. Now d5 is coming. Knight e3, e5. And yeah, black is just better. Black just now has a lot more space, open f-file, just like very comfortable position. The center is nicely defended. Just clear advantage. But doesn't quite play it right, so d3, b5. Yeah, b5 maybe not such a bad move, but to me it does feel a little bit early. Generally, I would want to play like bishop e6 first, and then rook a d8, and then you start pushing your pawns on the queen side. But first, get the pieces out, get the bishop on this diagonal, get the rook to the center. Get the pieces where they need to be in case the position opens up, and then start going b5 and so on. Because now b5, a4, white starts playing for the light squares. And, already if the bishop was on e6, then, black could play a6 in this position and keep everything defended. But here a6 is not possible, so black is forced to push. Bishop b3, and queen d6, rook d1. That said, things still work out quite nicely for black. Knight a5, b3, and we get this position, bishop e6, where, yeah, black just still has this kind of enormous space advantage. But still not so easy. h4, black goes d4, and this move's probably a mistake because it actually lets white out. White takes, knight c4. Now black takes this one, dc, and just like that, white actually has a very nice light square bishop that a couple moves ago was completely dead. So yeah, a bit misplayed here from black. Rook a c8, bishop d3, knight f5, bishop g5, and here black just blunders with knight takes h4. And I'm not sure exactly what black missed here, but must have miscalculated something because white ends up winning a piece. Maybe just missed white could take with the bishop. It's really not clear. Or maybe he was thinking a little bit deeper that takes rook f4. He would have this one. I'm not sure, but this is what ends up happening. Now white takes on e4, bishop takes c4. And okay, at this point, white is a piece up. And I should mention this was a classical game where time control was 90 plus 15, it looks like. So 90 minutes with 15 seconds increment. So healthy amount of time. And at this point, Spence writes that he, wanted to go bishop d3, and this was kind of his original idea, but started to see ghosts here. Specifically hallucinated the potential for black to generate a mating threat. And, okay, it's a sharp position. Queen is hanging. If queen e1, then rook e8 is kind of annoying there. Although I think white is certainly still okay, can defend the bishop. So sees some kind of ghost with bishop d3 and ends up playing rook takes d4, which gives back the piece essentially, because now black can take on e2, and after rook takes d6, rook takes e4, well, black gets the piece back, and that's a real shame. Knight d2, white is still better, but okay, the equal material. And a moment ago we were up a piece. So Spence writes, he kind of deliberately simplifies here to guarantee the advantage, rather than risk losing and getting into a scary position. And then Spence writes, on reflection, this doesn't seem like any way to play chess. And it's there is something to be said about trying to keep things safe, but with everything, it's a balance, So if you're up a queen and then you give back some material and you end up in an endgame where you're up a rook, but the opponent has no counterplay, I think, okay, that's kind of reasonable, right? Or if you're up 3 pawns and then you give 1 pawn back to go into some endgame, that's totally winning. Also seems like a very good and simple approach. But this seems like a little bit dramatic because after bishop d3, it doesn't feel, it's not really clear what we're so afraid of here. Like it's not like black has a million checks or like a million captures. If anything, our king seems pretty safe, like with the knight on f3, should be able to cover everything. So definitely some kind of like psychological, I think, thing going on here in terms of the mindset. And we'll see actually another moment later in the game, which might be even worse in terms of this thing where white kind of makes an inferior move knowingly, just trying to simplify. So yeah, bishop d3 I thought was, of course, the move. Maybe bishop d5 or something. Black can try to like take and open up the king. Even that's not really that scary. White should always be able to make room for the king. Can also play like queen e5 here and just completely, take over the position. So there definitely wasn't a reason to panic. But I kind of feel like this situation does happen a lot, right? Where because Spence is like lower rated player, about 200 points. He's got a piece up. His opponent blundered. We know we're winning, and again the nerves start to kick in, and we just want to simplify things and make it easy, easy, easy. But a lot of times that's going to be conceding stuff and giving away big chunks of the advantage. So we have to be really, really careful about these kinds of decisions where, we just give it all back just to kind of guarantee safety. In the long run, I think it's not going to be good for improvement. So rook takes d4, and like I mentioned, black should just go bishop takes e2, takes, and okay, white would be a little bit better, but the position definitely still very playable. Instead, black for some reason goes queen takes d4, and I think, yeah, perhaps a blunder, because on knight takes d4, bishop takes e2, white has bishop d5 check, and is able to take back on e2 and keep two pieces for the rook. So that was maybe black's idea, thinking he's winning the exchange after bishop takes e2, knight e2, rook e4, but bishop d5 check. Seems like this was what was blundered by black. And now white is actually back to totally winning. Two pieces for the rook. It's not as easy as it was before with the extra piece, but it's a very, very stable advantage because white's pieces have good squares and white doesn't have too many weaknesses. So game continues. Rook e1, rook c7, f3, king f6. And yeah, here we end up panicking a second time with bishop takes b3. Threatening knight d5 check, but of course black can get out with rook takes c3, takes, rook takes b3, and we have ourselves pretty much a drawn rook and pawn endgame because white is a pawn up, but black is going to win it back, and the king is in time to stop white's c-pawn. So this one should have been drawn. But yeah, I just want to go back to this moment because again we see the same thing from Spence. Position's completely winning. It's not going to be easy, but the two pieces are much stronger than the rook, and they're defending each other and very nicely coordinated. White also has a rook on the board that can help take pawns and attack stuff and so on. And so there was really zero reason for white to try and simplify. And once again, we're just giving up all of the advantage on the spot. In a position where actually black really had no threats. When the opponent's last move is just king g7 to f6 and the king is still cut off, what threats could the king possibly have, right? So from white's point of view, we don't have a lot of time. The strategy here is just to improve your position. Just go king f2, try to get the king closer, maybe rook e3, maybe g4 somewhere. You can try to start taking space. Slowly improve the rook e6 check, rook a6. Just try to look for like slow improving moves. And believe me, the position is a lot harder for black to play, especially if we keep our pieces on the board. Try to keep everything defended. Try not to hang anything. But yeah, I'm not sure if I was worried about rook takes c3. Of course, it doesn't work. But when we're low on time, we often are worried about lots of stuff. That kind of comes back to the thing we were talking about in the last game, where if you feel like you're panicking a lot in these time trouble situations, you need to either one, not get into them as often because you know that they're going to be difficult for you, and two, try to find some strategy where you're controlling your nerves because of course even the simplest positions and the most winning positions, they can all be blown and lost in time trouble if we're panicking and seeing ghosts and super stressed out. So definitely something to think about and reflect on. So yeah, and actually to my surprise, Spence ends up winning the game in this rook endgame, which okay maybe wasn't the easiest thing for black because white did have their rook behind the pawn. Though it should have been drawn, but I'll just show you guys the finish because I thought it was kind of instructive. Up until here, I think black is holding their own just fine and getting counterplay with the a pawn. The rook is nicely covering the second rank, but here's where black blows it actually with this move a3. Because then white's rook just gets behind the pawn, and now white has these like two connected passers, and this is a really difficult position for black because the rook is stuck in front of the pawn, and it's very difficult to extricate the rook without losing the pawn. So black can play rook a1 check and a2, but then we'll have no threats here, and white can just run his pawns up the board and is just winning very easily. Actually, very instructive version of this endgame what took place in the first tiebreak game of the Carlsen-Caruana match, where Magnus ended up winning a very similar rook endgame, except I think he had maybe like G and H pawns, but it was like 2 pawns versus 1. His rook is behind the pawn, and it's a very, very clean win because black's rook simply can't do anything. So this is where black kind of messed it up. I think any like rook move like this, and then the king can come to b6 and challenge white's rook. And the point is like rook a5. Black has this kind of nice idea where the rook defends the pawn from the side, and then white's rook just has very few squares to live on. And so the king can just keep chasing the rook. King b7, king b6, king b7, and so on. And we should get a draw because the rook can't leave the a file. Then black's a pawn would start to run. And so, yeah, black should have had enough here. Ends up losing the game, actually. I'll just show you guys the end. So now white's rook is in time, and white's just starts running the g-pawn. Not sure why we went king f2 in the position. I think as a rule, I would prefer king g2. I think this would have been safer, but anyway, king f2, a2, g6, rook h1. This would have been avoided if the king was on g2, but g7, all is okay. And turns out that white is still promoting first, because black can play a1, but then white will take and then make the queen. So we did end up winning the game, which was very nicely done. I mean, not easy to win that rook endgame at the end. I thought that was well played by white to at least create some chances. But yeah, definitely the two big moments were the moments where white kind of willingly simplifies, but gives up way too much of the advantage here, giving back the piece with rook takes d4, which was definitely not needed. And then, of course, later on with bishop takes b3 and giving up all of the advantage here just to try to simplify things. Again, it's a bit unfortunate because this should have been just a very straightforward win, very nice win against high-rated player, and with a little bit more confidence, hopefully next time Spence can convert it. Okay, that wraps it up for this game. So I guess the big lessons there all about technique and just trying to keep your cool, improving your position. Let's go to the last game. All right, game 3. Oh yeah, a question from the chat. The point was here, black can throw in this one first. Which I think white knew was coming and went in for willingly. So this one first, and then and then takes, yeah, and then we get this rook endgame move. So that's what happened in the game. Actually, on that note, I think there was some trick here. I think this one was working, which is kind of nice. With the same idea to clear this d5 square, which actually forks the rooks no matter what. So that's kind of a very cute tactic. And of course, black doesn't have any rook c3 because white is blocking. So yeah, it was winning for white, but I'm not blaming Spence for missing the tactic here. It's really just the panic, I think, that caused the mistakes. Because actually, almost any move here I think is quite good, because it's very hard for black to stop this one, knight d5. It's like bishop e6 and so on. So this would have been pretty straightforward. But I think we can, yeah, kind of understand the mindset, because white really just wanted to clean everything off and try to reduce the losing chances. But we're also reducing the winning chances, of course. Okay, next game, we have Chess Gains against Mitch. This game was submitted by Mitch playing black. And yeah, this one also actually, I think, ends up being all about the technique, but maybe some different aspects to it. Okay, so we get the center game. I don't know why Chess Gains is messing around with this one. I don't really love it for white, but you know, actually Nepo plays this quite a bit, or has been playing this quite a bit. Not in classical, but still. So, okay, we get like the typical line here. This is even this line has theory that's been known for many years. White puts the queen on e3, eventually transfers it to g3, and in the meantime, black just develops very normally with knight c6, knight f6, bishop b4, rook e8. And here white goes queen g3, and black plays knight takes e4, which is still following today's theory. I remember back in the day, rook takes e4 was always the move, taking advantage of this trick, where the rook can't really be taken because black will end up winning material here. But this one, I think, even today is not so clear. Like Nepo has had this position a number of times, and will play like a3 here, and yeah, game continues, and it's pretty sharp. But anyway, knight takes e4 seems like a more solid choice. Takes, c3, bishop b7, white goes f4, because I think bishop h4 is kind of an annoying move here that black can throw in, and then d5 and so on. So f4, d5, bishop d3, and bishop f5. So as Mitch writes, typical theory, black sacrifices the exchange with amazing compensation. And yeah, I totally agree. This bishop on e4 looks fantastic. And I mean, it seems like just the whole line is really very, very questionable for white. Knight f3, queen d7. At this point, Mitch writes that he's out of book. And so this is it. But yeah, this one actually has been seen in a couple games before, bishop f5, and just preparing to recapture, which isn't that crazy, given that this position has been well known for many, many years. And so it's not that insane that the theory has developed a couple more moves down the line. But okay, at this point, after queen d7, now we're out of book, just putting the queen on a very logical square, defending the bishop, threatening rook a4 now. And now white is essentially forced to take this one, and we get this position. So black is given the exchange for a pawn, but actually, I mean, has really, really nice play, especially after the next move. It's clear that black has a ton of extremely dangerous ideas around white's light squares. So I think Mitch played this one well. Here black plays b3. And I think this is where the game deviates, because yeah, I checked like to see if there are games even at this point. There's a nice game by Grandmaster Avrik here as black, where his opponent played bishop d4. Okay, threatening mate, he played bishop f8. Now white played b3. Black goes queen b5, and c5. And now it's really, really bad for white because knight c4 check is coming next, and the bishop on d4 doesn't really have a great square. So bishop e5, knight c4 was played, knight e3, now the knight comes in to c2, knight g5, queen e2, and black was already winning. Just the initiative was way too strong. Also, this one is hanging, of course. So yeah, position overall is pretty difficult for white, but chess game starts with b3, which actually ends up being very, very clever because we go queen b5 here as black. At first I was thinking like, well, why not like bishop a3 check? but actually like king d2, and you know, I think white's king actually is safer on f2 in this position. So it was good that Mitch avoids this one, as I think it's actually pushing the king to a safer square. It's a weird position. I mean, it's black is only down one pawn in terms of the material, and just has like loads and loads of compensation for one pawn. So black is doing really well. But okay, when you're down the exchange, you're always a little bit worried that, you know, you're going to run out of compensation. So you do want to kind of keep the pressure going. Now queen b5, I think makes a lot of sense. But at least here white can play knight d4. So compared to the Avric game where the bishop is already on d4 and black has played bishop f8, then black gets to play like c5, and the attack starts running very smoothly. So on queen b5, knight d4 is played, and black goes queen c5. This one, yeah, I wasn't sure about, although it looks, I think black is still doing extremely well. In the interest of playing c5, you know, I thought queen a6 made a lot of sense, and I think this is probably was the most straightforward way just to attack and break open white's queenside. And I think we'll kind of see a pattern of maybe not like playing for the right break in this position. Yeah, but this move is very nice because it hits the queen and also covers the e2 square. And this kind of stuff still doesn't work for black, or at least it's not super clear. I was looking at this one as well because like black can take this pawn, and then bishop d2, and yeah, even this position is a little bit complicated because takes bishop c3 would be really bad for black. I think black is still okay, like queen c5, and white's king is of course weak, but yeah, maybe we want something simpler than this because it feels like black's position is good. So queen a6, I think at this point was definitely the move, and then we're just playing for c5. Bishop can drop back to f8, and black is doing really well. There's also some ideas, I think Mitch points this out with like bishop a3 check and stuff, like king b2, bishop a3. That's a very, very, very nice resource. It takes knight c4, and black is just mating, and otherwise c5 is coming, and once we get c5 in, we just start breaking everything open. Yeah, Jailer, this was I think a classical training game played online. Okay, anyway, we get queen c5, king b2, knight c4 check. Nice find. If white takes, then there's a check and mate coming, so well spotted. And king a1, knight takes e3, queen takes e3, and bishop takes g2. Now normally I'm afraid of taking such pawns, like opening up the g file to our king, but here I think it's perfectly justified because white doesn't actually have any real threats after bishop e4, and the bishop can come back to g6 at some point to cover, or black can play g6 or bishop f8. There's a lot of different ways to cover g7 here. Bishop f8 probably the easiest, or bishop f6 even better, as happens in the game. Queen g3, bishop f6. So honestly, nothing really wrong with how Mitch has played first 22 moves in this game. I think black is completely crushing here. But at this point, it just based on like the notes and what Mitch writes about the analysis, it seems like he wasn't fully estimating his chances properly here and thinking like, okay, he has compensation, he's fine, but he's not like completely winning or anything like that. But during the game, I would be thinking I'm like totally winning here as black. I mean, we have 2 pawns for the exchange, and we also have the 2 bishops, which look really, really strong, lined up against white's king. Like when the 2 bishops feel like they're about, they're prime position to checkmate, right? It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how white's king might be getting mated with these 2 bishops. I would definitely be feeling extremely optimistic for black here, and play accordingly. Try to just open up the position and crush white, because again, we're not down material, and we have all the compensation in the world with the 2 bishops. In fact, quite a few players believe that 2 bishops and a pawn is worth around rook and knight. Like normally you would need 2 pawns for the exchange, but if you have like 2 bishops against a rook and knight, you might only just even need 1 pawn, and you might be already fine there in many cases. Here black has 2 pawns, so it's like maybe even black is better in terms of the material, but it's really not about the material. It's really just about that this bishop is pointing directly at white's king, and black wins this game by opening up the bishop. Whether black has 1 pawn, 2 pawns, 3 pawns, 0 pawns, the way black wins is by opening up the bishop. So it doesn't even matter the number of pawns, honestly. And so that should have been the plan here. So white goes king b2 and e5, but e5 doesn't feel right. The first instinct here feels like b5, because we just want to get b4 and undermine the diagonal, right? This is the key weakness, the key target that we're trying to break. And then after a5, a4, Mitch kind of switches gears here and just starts playing, like improve the position, and no longer plays on the queen side. But I think this was a mistake. Now, okay, in the notes, Mitch writes like b5 was a really interesting idea suggested by Chess Gains. And Max was probably kind of feeling, yeah, his position is probably in trouble here, and the point is just to continue opening lines. But even this, actually, I feel like not even needed. I was just thinking c6. Like I think black has time. Just c6, b5. Just take your time. Now that we have this a4, a5 structure, and okay, now the b5 becomes the main breakthrough, like to try and open lines. So yeah, if we can get c6, b5, we can open the b file again, start opening some diagonals to the king. Should be just totally crushing for black. Like white still has no threats. So feels like we definitely underestimated the pawn breaks here and the strength of just opening the position. And a lot of times to checkmate the opponent, you don't really need some kind of crazy sacrifice, or you don't even need to calculate some like super force line. You just need to find the right pawn break to open things up and properly undermine the opponent's structure. So I think a couple moments we missed just along these lines. Like the first one was back here, just not playing queen a6 to keep the c5 square open. And then yeah, not going for b5, b4, which I think is a lot more natural to try and break up this this structure. And then here, once we get a4, a5, now c6, b5. That's how we open things up as black. And that seems simple, of course, during the game. It's never easy, but yeah, I think this was maybe the main mistake, is not looking for ways of really just kind of slowly but clearly opening the position. So yeah, we end up really misplaying this part of the game, and kind of leads to this decision to play bishop takes d4, where yeah, black just gives up the bishop and kind of loses a lot of the chance for dynamic counterplay. And I don't think black should really be worse yet, but it happens very quickly because we end up going rook e4 and also trading off our one rook. And so now we get to a position where yeah, it's like only white can really be better anymore, because we've simplified too much, and the rook is going to be stronger than our bishop always. And yeah, now it's just white that is playing for the win. So it seems like we just didn't know what to do in the position, and we make moves that seem to achieve something, but I think it's just kind of helping the opponent. for the most part. And yeah, so now ChessGains, I think, plays this one really well, and he finds this nice way to force the queen trade, and now the endgame is winning for white. There was some interesting analysis here, but the main thing, I think, from this point, because white starts pushing on the queen side, is here. And this is where black has to make a big decision whether or not to play b6. Material-wise, black isn't doing that bad, like bishop and 2 pawns for the rook, but of course the problem is that everything is very passive and white's king can just get in very easily. So b6, I think, has to be right to just kind of keep the white king out. And if white plays a5, of course, to trade this one off, then black is very happy to trade off as many pawns as possible. Mitch mentions he didn't want to do this one because it's weakening, and indeed white has rook e8 and rook b8. But the alternative, as happens in the game, is to just kind of sit the position and sit on the position here with bishop d3. And this, of course, doesn't end well. And in general, when you have this choice, like if you try to trying to keep a fortress, or at least trying to make things complicated and play for counterplay, because let me be clear, after b6, it's definitely not like easy for white to win this one. Like white has to be pretty precise. They got to go rook e8 going after the b pawn, but this allows black to play king f5 and start creating counterplay on the king side. Now c5 is possible here. There's different ideas. Black can also try this one and then just try to run the g pawn. Okay, white should still win this with accurate play, but these kinds of positions are rarely simple, and there are many ways to go wrong, just because there's few pawns on the board. So this was definitely still worth a shot, because at least black gets counterplay and gives white a lot of chances to mess up. What happens in the game is we play for the fortress, but the problem with trying to hold the fortress is, like, you better be right. And if your opponent has just one idea to break through or one way to win, then it's just lost. so you're basically hoping beyond hope that there's no way to break through. And so if you're not totally sure, and usually in positions like this where we're very passive and we don't have counterplay, usually there is going to be some kind of breakthrough. Right here, white is just playing for rook takes b7, and then the a pawn is super strong, and so that's all white needs to win the game, which is not hard for white to find, right? Just looking at the position, it basically suggests itself. So definitely I think b6 here was still going to pose a lot more problems. Does black still lose the game? I think that's definitely likely. White should have good chances here, but of course we always want to make things as difficult as possible for the opponent. And if you have a choice between an endgame where, some kind of pawn race, both sides have passed pawns, versus something where you're just passive and you're just waiting for the opponent to break through, I would probably lean towards the counterplay side. Not every time. Sometimes it's better to kind of play it safe, but in general, I think playing for counterplay is probably going to create more chances in the long run. And you might even win some games, from doing this kind of thing. Yeah, in the game, I think white was able to convert this one pretty easily with the rook. The rook just comes in. Yeah, king g7, f6. It's very slow. White will just play rook e7, takes, and the a pawn is faster. It's just more advanced. Yeah. But okay, very interesting game. I think main points there were on the middle game and just how to play this position. And it seemed like, yeah, black just didn't quite estimate their chances well enough here, because even at this point, I feel like black just has an absolutely beautiful position. Just 2 bishops, no material down, safer king, and yeah, very simple play on the queen side to try and open up white's king. All right, guys, that is gonna do it. Hopefully, you found it helpful.